Joining me now on Waterloo Live is Tony Pollard, Professor of Conflict History and Archaeology and Director of the Centre for Battlefield Archaeology at the University of Glasgow and Archaeological Director at Waterloo Uncovered. Tony, thanks very much for your time. I know you're a very busy man.
It's a pleasure, Zach. Good to be here.
Why is it that so few bodies of victims have ever been found to generate this discussion?
It is a very interesting point, and it's one that, as our project with Waterloo Uncovered at the battlefield has continued over the years, began to really fascinate me, because we've done very intensive work, including geophysical survey, which you would hope might throw up buried features such as pits that have bodies in them. We've done a lot of excavation, we've done a lot of metal detector survey, etc. But we started in 2015, and site after site, feature after feature turned out to be something other than a grave site. And it started to puzzle me. So it was at that point I kind of hit the books and the archives and looked for answers to that. And came up with some possibilities. One was the old chestnut about bones being removed in the decades following the battle for the use in fertilizer, for phosphates, and ground down and used as bone meal. And I've still not gone off that idea. I think that is one reason. I've looked at some of the records in the UK. There are major importers in England and in Scotland of bones from animals, whale bone, bird poo, guano, but also human bone. And we know that battlefields like Leipzig, bones came from there. And I don't see why this wouldn't be happening at Waterloo. We have various newspaper stories from the 1820s talking about bones coming from Waterloo. Going back to the archaeology, we continued to work. Most of our early work was centered around Hougoumont, obviously the scene of very serious fighting throughout the day of the battle. And then we moved over to Mont-Saint-Jean, and not having found anything at Hougoumont related to burial, we had one or two close calls. We had strong magnetic signals that indicate burning or can indicate burning, and we excavated those. And rather than funeral pyres, because the important thing is, one of the reasons we don't have bodies is that a lot of them were actually burned. And I've been looking at eyewitness accounts from the days, weeks and months after the battle, and a lot of the bodies were cremated as well as buried. So that's part of the explanation. But these high magnetic signals, when we excavated them, turned out to be the site of brick kilns. And quite excitingly, these are the sites where the bricks that Hougoumont farm is built out of were created right in the neighborhood, front and back of the farm. And so what we've got there is really the genesis of Hougoumont, but as I said, don't relate to burial. And then we moved from Hougoumont to Mont-Saint-Jean, behind the ridge where Wellington's army was positioned. And famously, Mont-Saint-Jean farm was the site of his main field hospital, a very busy place on the day of the battle. And we were in an orchard outside the farm at the back and doing metal detector survey, some great finds, including our first cannonballs. But then we struck in 2019 a really phenomenal feature. And it was thanks to Gary, our metal detectorist, called us over at one point and said, I've got a metal detector signal, but there's something weird going on. He was excavating down very carefully to reach this piece of metal. But before he reached the metal, he found a piece of bone stuck well into the earth. And so we called in a excavation crew and exposed that area, opened it up very carefully. And lo and behold, what we had were human bones. And by the time we finished that 2-week season in summer of 2019, we had uncovered quite phenomenally the remains of 3 human amputated legs. And this was an incredible discovery. draw back from using words like exciting when we're dealing with human remains, but it's difficult not to be engaged at that level as well as the emotional. And so we had 3 legs that had clearly been sawn off wounded soldiers. We could see that the shattered bones in the legs that had caused those amputations to be necessary. And of course, medicine at the time is reasonably primitive, no anesthetics, no antibiotics. We don't know whether the men who lost these legs survived. We know that men did. Some people survived incredible wounds. But nonetheless, we had 3 legs lying in a heap. And the metal, they were lying on top of a load of tin iron, which had some shape. We now know, after further excavation, that they are the liners from the ammunition pouches. So these are the things that would have a white strap, the black leather box, and then inside the box, you've got the tin liner. And that's what they are. So this is where ammunition boxes have been pulled off soldiers. And of course, when they're brought to a field hospital, the first thing that happens is their uniforms and clothes are stripped off. And this is where these have been dumped. And there is a wonderful painting of a burial taking place at Hougoumont, the site of which we haven't found, despite our efforts, of bodies being at the south gate, bodies being dumped into a grave pit, all naked. But by the grave pit, there is a pile of bonnets and hats, shakos, tunics, and a load of these ammunition pouches. So that's what we've got. So what they've done here is, in a pit, they've dumped a load of these pouches, and then on top of that, they've deposited 3 amputated legs. Now, they went away to our colleagues' laboratory in Brussels and were examined. And one of the things that came out of that examination is that one of them contained a fragment of a French musket ball. It had actually broken up on impact with the bone, so there's about half of it. It's quite clearly 6.9 caliber, so it's a French musket ball. So that was the cause of the wound on that individual. So a phenomenal discovery, and it was quite clear from the archaeology that we did then that there was more to come.
So it's really interesting to see how this project has developed and how you kind of expanded your work in light of all of these kind of discoveries and this kind of ongoing relationship that you have with the landscape, I guess. I gather that once you'd made the Mont-Saint-Jean discovery pre-pandemic, it was kind of inevitable that you were going to go back and look for more.
It was, and obviously we were very much looking forward to going back and continuing that work. We had encountered a few meters away from the amputated human bones, the signs of animal bones eroding out of the archaeological section. And we thought they were horses. So there was something else going on there. So we were desperate to get back and continue that work. There's only so much you can do in a couple of weeks. And then, of course, COVID intervened. So we didn't go back in 2020. We didn't go back in 2021. All of Waterloo Uncovered's work went online with lectures and such like. But then in 2022, last year, we got to return, and we carefully backfilled those trenches so we could open them up quite quickly. Obviously, the human bones have been taken away to the lab, and we continued our work. And quite staggering, really, what we found just a few meters away in the same trench. Now, I was working on the hypothesis, obviously going away and scratching my head over those 2 years, working on the hypothesis that what we had was actually a ditch beside a road, a track that was behind the farm in 1815 and is still in a form there today. And what I thought we were looking at was debris from the farmyard, which had come out of the barn where the amputations were taking place and the operations. Part of the cleanup operation, they were sweeping basically stuff into this roadside ditch. It became clear quite quickly when we returned last year that it wasn't a roadside ditch. It was a deliberately dug, quite shallow trench with a flat bottom. And we continued to work with those animal bones, and they turned out to be horses. And indeed, we fully excavated the skeletons of 3 horses lying on their sides, nose to tail. We know there are more. We did a trial excavation further up. There's another horse there. And then, so that's one side of this pile of ammunition boxes and amputated legs. On the other side of it, in the lower part of the trench, we found our first complete human skeleton, with another amputated human leg lying alongside it. So that was a really notable discovery, given the only other human skeleton to be recovered from Waterloo archaeologically was an excavation by my colleague Dominique Vasco in 2012, when they were doing a watching brief on the new museum, and in the area of the car park that was going to be, they found a human skeleton buried in quite a shallow grave. So this discovery last year is the first complete burial, rather than deposition or dumping, that we've come across. So a staggeringly interesting feature, and actually quite unique. Burials, as you know, related to Napoleonic battlefields are quite rare. There are examples out there. There's Aspen, Wagram, some possibly related to Austerlitz. And they include horse burials. There are examples of horse burials. They tend to be individual horses in pits. What we've got here is a long pit that contains human amputated limbs, human burials in the form of a complete human being, and horses. Now, the interesting thing about the horses is, again, Gary ran his metal detector over the skulls of these because they had holes in them, and each one of them, as far as I recall, contains a musket ball. So these are horses that have been put down. They've been euthanized. And so what we have there, in addition to a burial and dumping pit, is a killing pit. And we can see from the skeletons that some of these horses have suffered horrific injuries to the legs. And they've been walked in to this pit. There must be a ramp or something at one end. They've been walked in. Once in position, a musket or a pistol has been put to their head, and they've been shot, and they just dropped. So again, quite a moving image. And through the researches I've done, I'm obviously, as an archaeologist, I describe myself as inhabiting a place called Aftermath. I'm not there for the battle. I could never be there for the battle, but I still today, 200 plus years after, I am inhabiting the aftermath. So the clearance of the battlefield is of great interest to me. So over the last couple of years through COVID, I was deeply immersed in accounts of visitors, both military and civilian, who saw the battlefield change once the fighting was over, and that includes the burials, the burnings, the clearing of the artifacts, etc., the growth of the site into a heritage site. And of course, there's a lot of work these days in what we call dark tourism. So that's all been very fascinating. And in fact, on the anniversary of the battle this year, I have a paper coming out online, which anybody can look at. But there is one account by a Scottish soldier who describes being on the battlefield. I think it's the day after the battle, and seeing a horse, and it turns around to him, and it is missing one of its forelegs. It's a three-legged horse, and this soldier is obviously disturbed by this image, and he said, I deeply regret that I didn't have my pistol on me at the time, or I would have done the decent thing. And so, as well as thousands of men, thousands of horses were killed and maimed in this battle. And a lot of those that were maimed, they didn't have the option of, many of them have the option of a veterinary college or infirmary they could go to. They were put down. Whereas at least if you were a human and wounded, you had a chance of pulling through. But there's going back to the uniqueness of this site, there is no other feature like this on any of the other Napoleonic battlefields. This is, as far as I can see at the moment, unique. And as I've said, it's unfinished business. I think we are going to get, and I think there's a deliberate demarcation of this pit. I think one side we've got the horses, and the other side we're going to have human bodies. So I think we're going to find more human burials. As we don't know how long the pit is. We certainly know it's longer than the section we've opened. So thanks to the good graces of Anthony Martin, who owns Mont-Saint-Jean, which is today a brewery. I'd give a plug for his beer. Waterloo beer is very good. Other beers are available, but Anthony's is particularly good. So I'm really looking forward to returning to that site, because it is challenging. It's emotionally challenging. It's archaeologically challenging. But we really are now changing our understanding and adding to our understanding of the aftermath of warfare at this time. And it's unfortunately not going to happen this year. We're going back to Waterloo this year, but with a smaller team and for a shorter period of time. And our efforts will be focused this year on the area to the south of Hougoumont, which was woodland at the time. It was one of the earliest scenes of fighting during the battle in the morning of the 18th. So we're returning there to look at a couple of targets, because what we've done is a huge geophysical survey, probably one of the biggest ever done on a historic battlefield. And we have a lot of anomalies that we are testing, and so we're returning there. But we will, I sincerely hope, be returning to Mont-Saint-Jean next year.
Well, we'll look forward to hearing the results as and when they come through. Waterloo Uncovered is a fantastic organisation, folks. We're going to put details of how you can find out more about their work and how you can support their work in the comments within this video and also within the live stream. So please do have a look at those. It's a cause that I believe very passionately in, and I say that as somebody who runs the War Graves charity. Professor Tony Pollard, it's been fascinating talking to you, Archaeological Director at Waterloo Uncovered and Director of the Centre for Battlefield Archaeology at the University of Glasgow. Thank you very much for joining us here on Waterloo Live.